Please, let me stay on your porch, just for one night." The voice was faint, trembling, nearly lost beneath the sound of a storm tearing through the Colorado mountains. Snow howled across the dark slopes, swirling in frantic gusts. Outside a solitary stone mansion, a young woman stood shivering, her body stiff and blue from the cold. Her clothes were barely more than scraps, an old, thin blouse clinging wetly to her shoulders, torn sleeves exposing pale skin, a skirt shredded by wind and snow. Her hair was tangled, heavy with frost. She pressed one trembling hand against the door, the other clutching at her chest, trying to keep her heart from breaking through her ribs. She knocked again, weakly. "Please, open the door." Inside, the house was silent, except for the ticking of an old clock and the low hum of the wind against the glass. Liam Carter, 35, lifted his head from the blueprint spread across his desk. He had been sitting there for hours, lost in the steady rhythm of nothingness, a rhythm he had lived by since the day his sister died. The world had shrunk to the sound of the storm and the slow beating of his heart. No phone calls, no visitors, no reason to open the door until now. He froze, listening. A second knock, so faint it could have been his imagination. Then a third. Softer still. He rose, hesitating at first, his hand hovering over the doorknob. A lifetime of isolation had trained him to keep people out. But the wind carried another sound, a gasp, a plea. He turned the lock. The door swung open, and the cold slammed into him. A woman stood on the threshold, shaking so hard she could barely keep her balance. Her skin was ghostly white, her lips purple. Her eyes lifted to his, glistening with tears and snow. "I just want to sleep on the porch." "Don't kick me out." Liam stared at her. For a long, heavy moment, neither moved. Then he saw it, the small silver pendant hanging from her neck. A crescent moon. His breath caught. He knew that pendant. He had made it himself years ago as a gift for Lila, his little sister, the same one who had died in an accident 3 winters ago. His chest tightened, as if the air itself had turned to ice. He blinked once, twice, half believing this was a cruel trick of his grief. But the woman before him was real, flesh, breath, trembling life. The storm roared behind her, scattering flakes into the room. Liam stepped aside, his voice low and rough. "Come in." For a heartbeat, she just looked at him, disbelieving, afraid. Then she stumbled forward, crossing the threshold. The door closed with a heavy thud behind her, sealing out the blizzard's fury. Snow fell from her hair onto the polished floor, melting into small, perfect drops. Liam watched her wrap her thin arms around herself, shivering uncontrollably as she tried to speak, but couldn't. He fetched a blanket, draped it gently over her shoulders, and for the first time in years, the silence in that house felt different, alive. He didn't ask her name, she didn't offer it, but in that moment, 2 strangers in the middle of a storm, something unspoken passed between them. A question, a promise. And as the wind wailed outside, Liam realized that the door he had opened tonight wasn't just to save her life. It might, somehow, save his own. The mansion was quiet, too quiet. Only the wind brushed against the thick glass walls, whispering in uneven breaths as snow piled higher outside. The world beyond the window had turned white and shapeless, as if nothing else existed beyond these walls. Liam Carter crouched near the fireplace, stacking 2 pieces of wood with careful precision. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. When the flames finally caught, they painted the room in a soft amber glow. He turned back toward the young woman. She sat stiffly near the doorway, still wrapped in her thin clothes, her damp hair clinging to her cheeks. He walked over, gently placed a folded wool blanket around her shoulders and handed her a steaming cup of tea. "Drink," he said quietly. Her hands trembled as she took the cup. Steam rose between them, curling in the air like a fragile thread connecting two strangers. After a long silence, her voice came, barely above a whisper.
"Ellie," that was all she said. Her name, no last name, no explanation.
"Just Ellie," Liam nodded, sitting across from her on the other side of the fire. He didn't ask where she came from or how she'd found this place. He had lived long enough to know that some questions didn't need answers right away. The fire snapped softly. Shadows shifted across the stone floor. They sat like that for a long time, two quiet figures surrounded by the restless wind. And in that stillness, fragments of Liam's past began to surface. Uninvited but unstoppable, he had once been a prodigy, a name that lit up Silicon Valley headlines. Liam Carter, the visionary who founded a revolutionary software company at 25. Investors loved him. Journalists followed him. He'd been the kind of man who filled rooms with ideas and laughter, whose future seemed too bright to ever dim, and then everything stopped. His sister, Lila, his only family, the one person who reminded him to live, Bailey, was gone.
A car crash. A single phone call in the middle of the night.
1 minute, she had been leaving a conference.
The next, she was just
gone. Liam could still remember standing at the crash site, rain, sirens, the smell of gasoline and metal. He had built entire empires out of logic and code, but nothing could explain the silence that came after. He sold the company within a month,
moved out of the city,
bought this place, a mansion of glass and stone perched against the mountains where no one would come looking. At first, the silence had been unbearable. Then it became familiar.
Eventually, it became all he had left. Now, watching the woman, Ellie, sitting by his fire, that silence felt uncertain, different. Her presence was faint, almost invisible, yet it carried warmth.
Something fragile that his world had long forgotten. She sat quietly, staring into the flames, her eyes reflecting the dance of light. He noticed her breathing begin to slow, her shoulders relax beneath the blanket. For the first time since she arrived, she looked at peace. Liam leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. The snow outside shimmered faintly under the moonlight. He wondered how many nights he had watched that same view, pretending the world beyond the glass didn't exist. He thought of Lila again. If she were here, she would have opened the door without hesitation. She would have smiled, offered warmth, made conversation, all the things he had forgotten how to do. But somehow, the stranger who called herself Ellie had done it for him. Not with words, but simply by being there. The fire cracked. Ellie shifted slightly, curling up beneath the blanket. Her head tilted to the side, and within moments, she was asleep. Liam stayed where he was, watching her breathe, unsure why he couldn't look away. He realized he hadn't shared silence like this with anyone since Lila's death.
It didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt alive. He exhaled slowly, leaning closer to the fire.
The light flickered across her face, soft and unguarded. Two strangers, one house, and somewhere between the snow and the silence, a story had quietly begun. The storm didn't stop the next day. Snow kept falling in slow, heavy sheets, covering everything in sight. The world outside had vanished into white, and the mountain road that led down to town was now just a long, frozen silence. Liam stood at the doorway that led to the living room. Ellie sat by the window, staring out at the endless snow. She had not asked for anything. Not food, not clothing, not even conversation. He had told her she could stay until the storm passed. She only nodded once, quietly, and returned to her place by the glass. That was 3 days ago. She spoke very little. When she did, her words were simple, polite, never more than they needed to be. There was a kind of restraint in everything she did, as if she were constantly bracing for something that might never happen. Liam didn't push. He didn't ask where she came from or why she had been walking through the storm dressed in rags. He simply made sure she had food, a blanket, and space. In the daylight, she stayed near the window. Sometimes she would trace shapes into the fogged glass, circles, lines, something that looked like the outline of a bird's wing. Then she'd wipe it away before he could see too clearly. Other times, she would just sit there, unmoving, watching the snow fall like she was waiting for it to tell her something. He watched her in silence. He told himself it was curiosity, but deep down he knew it was something else. The house had always been filled with silence, but this was different. It wasn't the hollow silence of grief anymore. It was a living one, a silence that breathed with someone else in it. At night, when the wind howled, he would hear her pacing softly in the next room. Sometimes she hummed just a note or two, then stopped, as if she'd startled herself with the sound. On the fourth night, the lights went out. It was sudden. The hum of the generator stuttered. Then everything fell into blackness. The house became a shadow, swallowed by the storm outside. Liam reached for a flashlight, but before he could turn it on, he heard her breathing. Fast, ragged, panicked. "Ellie," he called softly. No answer. Only the sharp, uneven sound of air catching in her throat. He found her crouched beside the couch, her hands pressed to her ears, eyes wide with terror. Her voice came out in fragments, trembling.
Please, turn on the light. Don't.
He stopped where he was. The air between them seemed fragile, like one wrong move might shatter it completely. He said nothing more. Instead, he struck a match, just one, and lit a single candle. The soft flame flickered, painting her face in gold and shadow. He placed it gently on the floor between them and stepped back.
"It's okay," he said quietly.
"You're safe." She didn't answer. But her breathing began to slow. Her hands fell from her ears, and her gaze fixed on the small light that separated them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The candle flickered. The wind moaned. The world outside was still falling apart, but in that small circle of light, something fragile began to hold. Liam sat across from her on the floor, his back against the wall. He didn't ask what memory had taken her or what fear had followed her into this place. He didn't need to know. Some wounds spoke for themselves. The night stretched on, quiet except for the storm. The candle burned low. When Ellie finally lifted her eyes, there was something different in them. Not relief, not gratitude exactly, but a faint recognition, as if she'd seen for the first time someone who wouldn't demand explanations. That was the night the house stopped feeling like a tomb, and the night Liam realized that the warmth he'd lost long ago had quietly returned, one fragile breath at a time. It was deep into the night when the storm finally began to fade. The mountains outside were quiet again, wrapped in a blanket of untouched snow that glowed under the pale moonlight. Inside the house, the fire still burned softly, throwing gentle waves of warmth across the living room. Ellie had changed. Not much, but just enough for Liam to notice. She no longer flinched when he spoke to her. Sometimes she even smiled, small, fleeting things that appeared and vanished like the sparks rising from the firewood. She had begun to help around the house, quietly, without being asked. She folded the blankets, rinsed the cups, swept the hall. Her movements were careful, graceful in their simplicity, and once, when she thought he wasn't watching, she hummed a melody, just a few soft notes that disappeared into the crackle of the fire. Liam didn't interrupt her. He simply watched from across the room, pretending to read, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. There was something almost unreal about the way her presence filled the empty spaces he had long ignored. One evening, He returned from the study and found her sitting at the table, a scrap of old paper spread before her. A pencil moved lightly between her fingers. She didn't notice him at first. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her hand moving slowly, tracing lines and curves with quiet focus. The air felt different, softer somehow. When he finally stepped closer, she looked up, startled.
"I'm sorry," she said quickly, as if caught doing something wrong. He shook his head.
No, it's fine. What are you drawing? Her eyes flicked down to the paper. Just a place I see sometimes. When I close my eyes, Liam glanced at the page and froze. The drawing showed a small wooden cabin nestled among tall pine trees with a narrow stream running beside it. He knew that place. It was the same cabin where he and Lila had spent every summer as children, before their parents died, before life scattered them in different directions. "You've been there?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. She blinked, confused.
"No, I don't think so."
"I just draw where I feel safe." Her answer silenced him. The fire popped in the background, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. That night, after Ellie went to sleep on the couch, Liam sat alone in his study. The house was still. Snow pressed softly against the windows, muting the world outside. He turned on his old laptop, the one he hadn't touched in years, and opened the folder of emails he'd kept from Lila. Most were short messages, reminders, random thoughts, bits of laughter frozen in text. But then he found one he hadn't read in a long time, dated just a week before her accident. "Met a girl named Ellie at the shelter today. She reminds me of who I used to be. Gave her the moon pendant you made. She said it made her feel seen." Liam's hand trembled as he reread the line. The pendant, the crescent moon hanging around Ellie's neck, the one he had crafted years ago, hammering silver into shape for his sister's 21st birthday. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in.
It wasn't coincidence.
The girl who had knocked on his door in the middle of a storm, half frozen, lost, desperate, was the same girl his sister had once helped. For a long while, he couldn't move. His chest tightened with something he couldn't name. Grief, wonder, maybe both. He turned off the lamp and looked out the window. The storm clouds had cleared, leaving a vast, quiet sky scattered with stars. It felt as though Lila was somewhere out there, watching, whispering. And maybe, just maybe, she had sent Ellie back. Not to remind him of loss, but to show him what it meant to keep living. In the next room, Ellie shifted in her sleep, the faint glimmer of the silver pendant catching the firelight. Liam sat there, eyes fixed on the door between them, his heart beating to a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. The snow had begun to melt. Days of silence had given way to soft dripping sounds from the eaves, the slow trickle of water along the stones. For the first time in weeks, the sky above the mountains was clear and blue. Liam stood outside, chopping firewood. The rhythmic crack of the axe was the only sound that filled the air. Inside, Ellie moved quietly through the kitchen, her small frame framed by the window. She was wearing one of Liam's old sweaters, grey, slightly oversized, its sleeves rolled up to her elbows as she boiled water for tea. She hummed faintly under her breath, unaware that the morning's calm would not last. A black car rolled up the long, snow-lined path that led to the mansion. Its tires crunched over the thin layer of frost. When Liam looked up, his expression changed. The car door opened, and a woman stepped out, tall, elegant, wrapped in a fur coat that looked like it had never seen snow. Margaret Carter, his mother. Liam's jaw tightened. He hadn't told her about Ellie, or even that he was no longer alone in the house. But of course, Margaret always found a way to know what he didn't say. When she entered the living room, her eyes immediately swept the space, every surface, every shadow, before landing on Ellie, who was setting down 2 cups of tea. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret's lips curved into a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So," she said softly, "this is the reason you've stopped answering my calls." Liam's voice was steady. "Mother, this is Ellie. She—" "Yes," Margaret interrupted. "I can see what she is." Her gaze ran over Ellie, the old sweater, the frayed hem of her jeans, the bare feet against the floor. It wasn't cruelty in her tone so much as dismissal, as though Ellie were a misplaced object in her son's house. Ellie lowered her eyes, clutching her hands together. The room filled with a silence sharp enough to cut. Liam tried to redirect the conversation, offering his mother tea, steering talk toward anything else. But the air was already poisoned. Too heavy, too cold. Margaret said little after that, but her eyes never stopped judging. That afternoon, when Liam went out to check the generator behind the house, Margaret found Ellie standing near the porch.
"Ellie, was it?"
the older woman said, her tone polite, too polite. Ellie turned startled. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret's gloved hand reached into her purse. She pulled out a white envelope, thick, perfectly folded, and set it on the wooden railing between them. "This," she said, "should be enough for you to go wherever you want."
"I don't wish to see you near my son again." Ellie stared at the envelope. "You think I'm here for his money?"
Margaret's smile didn't change. "You're poor. You need it.
"And my son needs peace."
This will make things easier for everyone." Her voice was calm, but colder than the snow that still clung to the mountain peaks. Ellie's hands trembled, though not from the chill. She took a step forward, her voice barely holding steady. "I've been hungry before. I've been looked down on before. But I've never sold my dignity. Not for warmth, not for kindness, and certainly not for money." She placed the envelope back on the railing, her fingers shaking as she turned away. "Keep your money, Mrs. Carter. It means nothing to me." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Her expression barely flickered, just the faintest tightening of her jaw. Ellie walked inside, collected her coat, and left through the back door. No note, no explanation. The wind had picked up again, carrying her footprints across the snow. When Liam returned that evening, the house was quiet.
Too quiet. He called her name once. No answer.
Her blanket was folded neatly on the couch. The cup she had used that morning sat in the sink, washed and placed upside down to dry on the porch railing. He found the envelope, unopened. He stood there for a long time, the air around him still and heavy. The house that had begun to feel alive again had gone silent once more. And this time he understood exactly what that silence meant. It wasn't solitude, it was loss. The storm had returned with a vengeance that night. The wind howled through the pine trees, carrying the sound of breaking branches and swirling ice. Snow hammered against the glass walls of the mountain house, but inside the silence was deafening. Liam stood by the empty couch, his mother's envelope still lying where Ellie had left it. He had asked one question, "Did you speak to her?" And the look in Margaret's eyes had told him everything he needed to know. His chest tightened. He didn't wait for an explanation. He threw on his coat, boots half-laced, and stepped out into the storm. The world outside was a blur of white. The snow came down in waves, heavy and relentless, blinding his vision. Each breath burned his lungs, each step sank deep into the freezing drifts. "Ellie!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. He stumbled along the narrow path that led down toward the forest, following faint footprints that were already disappearing under fresh snow. The storm didn't care. It wanted to erase everything, her steps, her warmth.
Her existence. He pressed forward anyway. His mind replayed her voice.
Her quiet laughter by the fire, the way she had looked at him without fear for the first time. And now she was gone. Because of him. Because he hadn't been there to protect her. Snow gathered on his eyelashes. His hands had gone numb. The cold crept through his bones like poison. He barely noticed when his knees gave way. He fell forward into the snow, his breath shallow, the world fading into white. Through the haze, a shadow appeared. Small, moving fast. He blinked, unsure if it was real. Then he heard her voice, faint but sharp through the wind. "Liam!" Her hands were on his shoulders, shaking him. She was crying. He could hear it in the tremor of her breath. "Why did you come out here?"
You could have died.
He tried to speak, but his lips barely moved.
Because, he gasped, his voice hoarse, I couldn't lose someone again. Ellie's eyes widened.
"Don't talk."
Come on. She lifted his arm around her shoulders, struggling against the snow, dragging him step by step back toward the lights of the house. By the time they reached the porch, both of them were trembling.
She pushed the door open with her shoulder and half carried him to the couch near the fire. Liam collapsed against it, his breath ragged, his hair soaked with melted snow. Ellie knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she peeled off his gloves and rubbed warmth back into his fingers. The flames flickered, reflecting in her tear-streaked eyes. "Why, Liam?" she whispered, her voice breaking.
Why would you go through that for me?
He looked at her, really looked at her. The fear, the kindness, the strength, hidden behind the fragility. And he said quietly, every word trembling with truth. "Because I couldn't stand the thought of losing someone again."
Not you, Ellie's breath hitched.
The world seemed to still around them. Only the crackle of fire and the faint hiss of melting snow filled the room. Liam leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "I don't see Lila when I look at you anymore," he said.
I see you, the girl who knocked on my door and made me remember what it feels like to be alive. For a long moment, Ellie said nothing.
Her eyes filled with tears, but there was no fear in them this time.
Only something softer.
Deeper. Then she whispered, almost inaudibly, "And I see a man who deserves to be loved." He closed his eyes, exhaling the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Outside, the storm began to fade. The wind softened into a sigh, the snow easing its fury. Inside, the fire glowed steady and warm, two hearts finding shelter in each other. Neither of them moved.
They didn't need to.
For the first time since that night she had knocked on his door, the silence felt safe. A few days after the storm, the mountains had settled back into quiet. The sky was pale blue, the snow thinning along the winding road that led to Denver. Liam drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, the world sliding past like a soft blur. He didn't tell Ellie where he was going, only that he needed to see his mother. The drive took hours, and when he arrived at the familiar house of glass and marble, it felt like stepping into a memory he had long outgrown. Margaret Carter opened the door herself. Her expression was unreadable. They spoke behind closed doors. No one knew what words passed between them, only that the conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. When Liam returned home that evening, the mountain air was still. Ellie was sitting by the window, sketching quietly when she heard the car pull up. She turned, anxiety flickering across her face. But when she saw him, the tension melted away. He looked peaceful. For the first time since she met him, there was no weight in his eyes. She set her pencil down.
Did you talk to her?
Liam nodded, removing his coat. "Yes. What did you say?" He paused, searching for the right words. Then, softly, he said, "Not about you."
About me, and what I choose to believe. Ellie didn't ask more.
She didn't need to. Something had shifted. Not in his mother, perhaps, but in him. From that day on, Margaret no longer interfered. She came to visit from time to time, her presence quieter, her eyes softer. When she looked at Ellie, the old contempt was gone, replaced by something cautious, maybe even respect. She never apologized, but sometimes silence speaks louder than any words could. Ellie noticed how Liam never spoke ill of his mother again. He simply moved forward in the way one closes a book, not because it ended badly, but because it had finally said everything it needed to say. Months later, the snow had melted completely. Spring wrapped the valley in green and gold. Liam and Ellie decided to leave the glass mansion behind. They found a small piece of land near town and built something new. Not a fortress of solitude, but a place meant for others to enter. It wasn't grand, not like the mansion, but it was full of life. A modest wooden building with large windows and the scent of paint, canvas, and warm bread. It became a small art and craft center, a place where women from shelters could learn, work, and rebuild their lives. It was the dream Lila had once written about. A home where broken things can become beautiful again. Now, Liam and Ellie made it real. One morning, as sunlight poured gently over the snow-tipped roofs, they stood on the porch of their new home. The air smelled of pine and fresh paint. Birds sang from the branches above. Liam leaned against the railing, looking at the distant ridge where his old mansion stood hidden behind the trees. He smiled faintly, then turned to Ellie beside him. "The night you knocked on my door," he said softly, "you asked to sleep on the porch." He reached for her hand, his voice low, tender. "But now I know, and you weren't asking to come in. You were opening the door for me." Ellie's eyes shimmered with quiet warmth. She smiled, not the fragile smile of someone who needed saving, but the steady one of someone who had found her place. "And I found mine too," she whispered. "Right here." They stood together as the sunlight spilled across the porch, golden and alive. The snow glistened on the far peaks, melting slowly under the warmth of the new day. Inside, laughter echoed from the small workshop, the sound of women learning, painting, living again. Outside, the wind carried away the last trace of winter, and for the first time, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like home.